Welcome back. Okay, so we already talked about some of the basic fundamentals of the hypershade. It was pretty boring, but basic fundamentals are always important to know. And in this video, we're going to go ahead and open up our first example scene. So let's just go ahead and jump into it and get started. Hit Control-O on the keyboard to open up the file browser here. And the scene you're looking for is called Shading Models Start. Starts in big capital letters, so you can't miss it. And this is the scene that we have. What we have over here is a bunch of spheres with different shaders on the left, and it says Maya shaders on the top. Then we have mental ray shaders over here on the right. If you're not familiar with what mental ray is or how it works, strongly recommend you have a look at our previous Maya product called Introduction to Rendering with Mental Ray in Maya 2009. That training product goes ahead and teaches you everything you need to know about mental ray in depth for the latest version of mental ray in Maya 2009. Strongly recommend you pick it up and use it so that you can go ahead and learn how to use mental ray effectively and efficiently. Okay? Now, the mental ray renderer is a third-party plugin renderer from Mental Images. It's available in Maya, has been for many years, and it still is. Okay? Because Maya comes with two main renderers. It actually comes with more than two renderers, but the two main renderers here is the Maya software renderer and the mental ray renderer. Okay? The mental ray renderer is capable of rendering many of the effects and many of the shaders from Maya, alright, but not all of them. The Maya renderer cannot render any shaders or materials from mental ray. For this training product, we are going to be using mental ray 100%. We're not going to be using the Maya software renderer at all, okay? Now, over here on the left, I have Maya shaders, so let's go ahead and jump in there. The purpose of this video is to quickly show you some of these different shading models and how they work. Okay, so if you come over here to this view button in the viewport and you go to bookmarks, I have two bookmarks set up for us already, one called Maya shaders, the other one called mental ray shaders. Let's go to Maya shaders very quickly here. Okay, and let's also go to our render settings, and you want to make sure that mental ray is loaded up. If it's not loaded up, go ahead and load it up here where it says render using, though it should be automatically because the scene was saved that way. If you don't even have the mental ray plugin loaded up, just go to a previous video in this tutorial where I showed you how to load up the mental ray plugin through the plugin manager window. Okay, so I'm going to hit 5 on the keyboard to make things look a little bit more interesting here in shaded mode, and what I'm going to do is simply hit the render button up here and go ahead and do a render. Let me go ahead and make that a little bit smaller. If I go over here to my options menu, I'm going to go to test resolution, and I'm going to go to render settings here, which is 640 by 480 pixels, just so it looks a little bit bigger and nicer. I'll hit render again. There we go. That's pretty nice. Alright. Again, I'm not going to really dive deep into rendering with mental ray or rendering in Maya in general. I'm just going to touch upon anything that's relevant to what we're doing. But if you really want to know about all this other stuff and how to work with rendering in a proper rendering workflow for production in Maya, strongly recommend you pick up that Introduction to Mental Ray training product for mental ray in Maya 2009 that I spoke about earlier. Okay, so here's some standard Maya shaders. Alright, if I look over here, I can actually pick these shaders and they all have the name to them. So if I click on this shader here, which happens to be this one right here, that's the anisotropic shader. The anisotropic shader is great for doing metallic type surfaces, so it's fantastic for doing brushed aluminum and other types of brushed metals. Very, very good for doing that. So if you look at certain types of cooking pans and pots and different things like that that usually have brushed metal surfaces in real life, the anisotropic shader is perfect for doing those types of materials in Maya. Okay, and it's a standard Maya shader. To go ahead and edit the parameters of that shader, you can do a couple of things. You can click on the object that has the shader and hit Control A on the keyboard to open up its attribute editor here, and then you can switch over to the material tab over here in the attribute editor. Another thing you can do is right click on top of the object to open up the right click menu. Make sure you're holding down the right mouse button and go down to where it says material attributes. That opens up an attribute editor window, but you'll notice that it only has tabs for anything that has to do with the material of the object. In this case, the left tab is for the shading engine, and the right tab is for the shader itself. So here it is, the anisotropic shader. You can rename it. You can also change different things. For example, you can change the color of the shader here, so you can make it, if you wanted to make it green, you can make it green. To see it update quickly in the viewport, what you can do is hit the IPR button, and then you can just click and drag a region around that shader. And you notice now that the interactive photorealistic renderer will kick in. So every time I make a change to the shader, you notice it updates almost instantly here in the render view window. So I can make this yellowish or orangish, reddish, whatever I want. Okay, and there's lots of different attributes here. There's transparency, so you can make this more clear like glass or a window or something like that. You can add some ambient color, which is going to brighten it up. You can add some incandescence to make it sort of self-illuminating, make it look like it's making itself glow a little bit. We can add bump mapping, we'll talk about that later. You can change the diffuse amount and things like that, make it darker, make it lighter, so on and so forth. And there's lots of different attributes. I'm not going to go over every single one of these attributes now. It's just going to pretty much waste your time. Trust me, don't worry about that too much. We're going to be working on hours and hours of production scenes, and by the time you're done, you're going to be thinking, whoa, man, did I learn a lot. Okay, so that's the idea. Over here in the next shader is a blend shader. If I go ahead and do a little render preview of that, you notice the way the blend shader looks. Blend shader is good for doing pretty much any material in general that needs any type of specularity or shininess to it. Things like plastic. You can also do metals with blend shaders, nice clean polished metals. Again, plastic, things like that. Even some glass can be done with blend if you want to. I don't really recommend it for glass, but you could. Nothing's stopping you from doing it. Again, same deal. You can right click on top of the blend, go to material attributes, or just hit Control A to open up the attribute editor. And again, we have very similar parameters here. We can change the color of the blend, watch it update in the IPR. We can change the transparency, we can change the ambient color, and all these different things. A lot of these parameters are very similar to the anisotropic shader, and a lot of shaders in Maya will have common parameters that are very similar across many different shaders. And some shaders will have parameters that are unique to them and only available with that shader. Then over here, the next material over, this is a Lambert here. If we go ahead and select that, that's the Lambert. Lambert shader doesn't have any shininess. It doesn't reflect anything, so you can't use it really for a mirror. It's pretty much good for any type of flat surface that doesn't have any shininess to it. Say a concrete sidewalk or a brick wall that has no shininess. It's just kind of dull. Okay. It's also good to use for things like fabric or anything like that, because fabric is not like glass. It doesn't reflect light, and it's usually not shiny unless you went ahead and spilled some champagne on it or something during a crazy party or something like that. Okay. Next shader over is the ocean shader. If I go ahead and select that, this is a very unique shader. If we go ahead and open up the attribute editor for that one and go over here to the ocean shader attributes, notice we have lots and lots of attributes here for the ocean shader. The ocean shader is a very unique shader because, as the name suggests, you can imitate an ocean, and it can be animated over time. Okay, so it's a great shader for using to imitate water surfaces and things like that. And you can see there's tons of parameters for adjusting this ocean shader. You can pretty much spend all day adjusting this ocean shader. You can see there's a lot of parameters for this ocean shader. Alright, but we're not going to be using it, so let's go ahead and close that. Looks pretty neat though. So we can already start to see that Maya has lots and lots of different shaders and materials to use. This shader here, you'll notice, looks very similar to the blend. That one right there is the Phong shader. Phong shader is very similar to a blend, a little bit different, has a couple of different parameters, and it's very good for doing things like plastic. You could use it for metal. I like to use it for things like plastic or maybe a really shiny rubbery kind of material, like something that's brand new, like a brand new pair of shoes or something like that. I don't know. And pretty much you could use it for a lot of different things. Over here you have a different Phong material, and this one over here is the Fong E. The Fong E is very similar to the Phong shader, but as you can see, there's a couple of differences here. If we go ahead and open up the attribute editor here, go to the Fong E shader, these are the different parameters we have. Basically, the specularity has a few different parameters that we can control. We have this whiteness parameter, for example, which kind of makes the material look a little bit rougher than the regular Phong. Okay, so it kind of gives it that powdery look, as you can see right there. It's a little bit hard to see, but it's right there. It's a pretty subtle effect. A lot of times with shaders, the more subtle the effect, the bigger the difference it makes in your scene in the end when you do your final render. So let me go ahead and do a render over this next shader. And if I go over here, this next shader is a ramp shader. Okay. Now the ramp shader is not a very realistic shader, but it's a shader that has some very flexible attributes for you. So you can go ahead and control this in different ways. So let me go ahead and change the color here to say green. I can go ahead and use this ramp, and the ramp works pretty neat here because you can create different colors here. Say for example I bring this in like this, and you can use this to create, let me just go ahead and maybe add a little bit of red here, put that at the end. You can see the way that it updates here. You know what I'm going to do so that it's more apparent? These reflections here are kind of killing the effect. So I'm going to go down here to reflectivity. I'm going to knock the reflectivity all the way down. And the way this works is pretty simple. You can see you have these little circles here with an X on the bottom. Each one of these are basically a point, a position that you can place on the ramp. So if I take this ramp and I increase it, I'm increasing the value. In this case, it's the reflectivity of the ramp. So I'm giving this more reflectivity. If I drop it all the way down, you notice that the ramp right here in the IPR is no longer reflecting the objects around it. Okay, because right now the selected value is 0, and if you have 0 reflectivity, you're not going to reflect anything. Okay, so let me go back up here to the color swatch, and you can see that by adding these different color positions, I can actually change the way that this ramp looks. So you can create some pretty interesting effects, as you can see here. You can change the interpolation to smooth, linear. You can put no interpolation, so the colors just drop off immediately. You can put spline interpolation, and it's pretty neat. You can also change the angle of the colors. Right now, the lighting, the angle of the lights in the scene are controlling what color displays on the surface. But you can also change that to facing angle, so now it depends on which direction the camera is looking at it from. So that looks pretty cool. It actually looks kind of creepy, almost like the shaders looking at us. Very scary stuff. Okay, we can also change the incandescence over here. We can change all kinds of different things here. So you can see this is a pretty interesting shader. It's very fake. It's not a realistic shader. But if you're going for some cartoony type looks or just some custom stuff, you can use this ramp shader to your liking. So you can start to see how the ramp shader is a very interesting shader and has a lot of possibilities and potential for you in your projects. And it works great with mental ray. Okay, so let me close that. And let's do a little IPR region here of this shader. And this shader, you notice, just looks like a white circle. This shader is a surface shader. Surface shader has no shading attributes besides a color. Okay, it doesn't reflect any light. It doesn't have any shininess to it, anything like that. It's basically just an out color. So it just gives off this color, so it looks 2D-ish. Doesn't look like a 3D object. Just looks like a circle painted in Photoshop or on a piece of paper or something like that. Okay. You can also give it some glow here, so that's pretty interesting. And a surface shader, you won't really be using it too much, but sometimes you just have to create certain objects or materials and things, and a surface shader just ends up being the best choice for the job. And right now, this isn't a good demonstration of one of those times, but we'll get to see that later. Actually, we will be using the surface shader in this training product in some of the production scenes, and you'll get to see how to use it to your advantage to complete some pretty nifty tricks inside of Maya. Okay, so there you go. Those are some standard Maya shaders. There's actually more shaders and nodes than this, but these are probably some of the most common ones that you'll be using. In particular, the Blinn, the Lambert, and the Phong shaders are probably 3 of the most commonly used Maya shaders that there are. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is, let me just go ahead and close that. I'm going to go ahead and go back to the view menu here in the viewport, go to bookmarks, and now let's go to mental ray shaders. Mental ray shaders. Let's go ahead and let's do an IPR. And I'm just going to render out this entire area. And there we have mental ray shaders. Pretty interesting. Okay, so let's have a look at how these shaders work and how they're a little bit different and similar to the Maya shaders. First shader here is the DGS Material. Okay, if I go ahead and right click on top of the sphere and I go to assign new material, you notice this section here says DGS Material, and all the way down to where it says Transmat, those are all mental ray shaders. And if I go ahead and go to my hotbox and open up the Hypershade, okay, come on Hypershade, there you go. Okay, here's the Hypershade. That's a lot of materials. Okay, if I go over here to the Create toolbar and I switch over to Create Mental Ray Nodes, notice that we have all these different sections and tabs down here. Okay, where we have all these different nodes for mental ray. Now, these shaders you see here, we actually have 1, 2, 3, 4, we have 8, we have 11 of these spheres representing 11 different shaders. Now, obviously, there's a lot more than 11 shaders here in the Hypershade in the Create Mental Ray node, in the Create Mental Ray Nodes tab. As you can see, there's a lot more than 11 shaders. There's no way I can show you every single shader. We would be here forever. There's just so many of them. So what I'm showing you here is probably 11 of the most common shaders, and actually some of these 11 aren't even really that common. You really won't use them too much. But I decided to go ahead and show you some of these and introduce them to you so you can see how they work. Okay, so if we go to materials, notice there's a lot of different materials to use. As you can see, when you go from Transmat down here all the way up to DGS Material, that's a lot. Okay, so let me go ahead and close that Hypershade down. I'm just going to do a render over here over the first sphere, which is the DGS Material. So I'll hit Control A to open up the attribute editor and go to DGS Material 1 tab over here. And you can see we have very few parameters to tweak. We have the fuse color, so we can actually change the color of this. So again, if you want to make it green, there it is. You also notice that it's very dark. The DGS Material is great for almost anything. You can use it for, say, wood. You can use it to do rubber. You can use it to do glass. You can use it to do ceramic tiles. You can use it for almost anything. Almost anything. Okay? Now, the bad thing about the DGS shader is that it can be a little bit slow to render when you're using glossy reflections. If we see here, we have the shininess parameter, which we can actually increase or we can decrease. As I decrease it more and more, you'll notice that the reflections here of the shader become more and more blurred out. Okay? Now, this is a very old shader, and really, it's not a good idea to use it in production anymore. This shader is pretty much obsolete because a new shader was introduced some time ago that pretty much replaced this shader in Mental Ray. But it's still here for you to use in Maya if you'd like to. Okay? So as I reduce this shininess down to something close to 5 or 6, you notice that the reflections become very blurry. The blurrier that your reflections are, the more anti-aliasing you need to fix that, and the longer your renders are going to take. Even though this is actually rendering pretty fast on this machine. We can actually increase the glossiness here to increase the color right there of those reflections. We can actually increase the specularity as well. As you can see, the effect that has, the IPR is great for doing that, quickly prototyping and testing out different shaders. We can also control the shininess in a single direction, in the U or V directions. We can also change the transparency to make this more like glass, something that's you can actually see through. And we can change the index of refraction over here, very similar to how real glass works. And again, the color over here, we can change the color of the glossiness and so on and so forth. There really aren't a lot of parameters. This shader is not too flexible and is not optimized at all. I strongly recommend that you do not use it, but it's there in case you want to. Then we have another shader here, which we can't see. Okay, so why can't we see it? Well, let's select it right there. This is the Dielectric Material. Let's open up its attribute editor. And this material is actually perfect for doing glass. That's actually what it's designed for. It's a dielectric, realistic, physical material for doing glass type objects and any objects that have transparency. So windows, say wine glasses, things like that. We can't see it right now because the background or scene is black and this thing is completely transparent. So I'm going to go over here to the Phong coefficient parameter and I'm going to increase that. And you can see it now. We can begin to actually see our sphere there with the dielectric material. Okay, you can change the color here, the index of refraction, the outside color, and a few other parameters. We're not going to be going over that simply because just like the DGS shader, this dielectric material is pretty much obsolete. You can still use it if you like. It's still available for you in Mental Ray for Maya, but it's not very optimized and it has very limited parameters here. There's actually another shader that was introduced a while ago that pretty much replaces this shader, can do everything this shader can do, and even more things. So there's really no point in using this shader unless you really want to. Okay. Then over here what we have is the mental images or mental ray car paint shader. And this shader is actually very interesting. If I go ahead and open up its attribute editor, go over here to the material tab here, we have a lot of parameters with this shader. This shader is fantastic because, as the name suggests, it imitates the way that car paint works. Okay, you can actually imitate those sort of little sparkling flakes that are underneath that coat of a brand new car paint, that is, and it can imitate a lot of different things, and it's great for doing metallic type things, and in this case in particular car surfaces or car shaders for brand new vehicles, bodies of motorcycles, things like that. And you're not just limited to that. You can use it for pretty much anything that you want to, not just cars or motorcycles, but you can use it for anything else too. And we have a lot of different parameters here that we can adjust. We have a base color, makes it nice and dark right there. It looks pretty cool. We can increase the ambience here, makes it real bright. Looks really nice, as you can see. This shader is also great because it uses Fresnel reflections, and you'll learn more about Fresnel reflections in another video further down in this training product. So don't worry about that. We'll get to that and you'll understand what that is. We also have some other parameters for doing flakes. It's a little bit hard to tell right here, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on this guy, do an IPR. There we go. You can start to see when we get close that we have these sort of strange little flaking objects in there. That's trying to imitate those little flakes, little sparkling effects that you see on a brand new car paint. So I'm going to open up the parameters there, and we can actually go down here to the flake parameters, and we can change the color of those flakes. So we can darken them up or brighten them up. We can also change the flake density here, so we can make it more dense. So you can see now we can see the flakes a lot more. We can also change the flake scale so we can make them smaller or larger. Change the look of these little flakes here. Okay, make them real small right there, and so on and so forth. We can also change the decay, the strength, and a lot of different parameters. I invite you to go ahead and test out with this scene and play around with the different parameters to start to better understand the shader, because as you can see we have a lot of different parameters here to control this shader with. Okay, so let me go back to my bookmark here of mental ray. Okay, and we have another shader over here which looks very similar to the car paint shader, and this is the metallic paint shader. It's basically a stripped down version of the car paint shader. Has many of the parameters that are available with the car paint shader, minus a few other parameters. So we still have the Fresnel reflections, we still have some flake parameters and the basic color parameters here, but the car paint shader has more parameters. So the advantage to using the metallic paint shader is maybe you don't want to use a shader that looks like car paint. Maybe you want to do something that looks more metallic, but a sort of general metallic material. You can use this one, which has less parameters. And the less parameters you have to tweak, the easier it is to work with the material, although you lose some flexibility and control. Okay? So now we have some pretty simple basic shaders. This shader down here, which is this one right here, is the MIA material, also known as the architectural material, the mental ray architectural material. And earlier, if you remember, I did mention that this material here, the DGS material, and this material here, the dielectric material, have actually been replaced or obsolete. And this is the material that pretty much took their job. And this is the architectural material. Its name is MIA material, but it's known as the architectural material. If I go ahead and select that object and open up its attribute editor here, you'll notice here that I have lots and lots of different attributes to control. I have attributes for diffuse, reflection, advanced reflection. We have refraction parameters as well as advanced refraction. We have anisotropy parameters, and we'll get to see how to work with that later. And we have BRDF parameters, which we'll learn about later, as well as translucency and a few other parameters here. We have lots and lots of parameters. This MIA material, or architectural material as I'll refer to it from now on, is a very advanced shader. It was introduced some time ago in mental ray to address some issues with the DGS material and the dielectric material. Basically, this architectural material, it's a super material if you want to think of it that way. And what I mean by super is that this material can pretty much imitate almost any surface that you need for 3D. If you need to imitate a carpet, if you need to imitate glass, a wine bottle, if you need to imitate water or liquids, if you need to imitate stone, if you need to imitate ceramic tiles, fabric again, any type wood, almost any type of material in the real world can be imitated by this architectural material. That's why it's known as the architectural material, because it's used heavily in the architectural visualization industries. But that doesn't mean that you can only use it for that. You can use it for anything you want, okay? You can even use it to do the metallic finish on, say, an assault rifle or something like that in your scene, if that's what you're doing. Maybe you're not doing architectural visualization. Maybe you're doing a high-end cinematic scene for a game intro or something like that. You can use this material for that if you like to. And it's a very highly optimized material. Now, I'm not going to go over any of the parameters now because we're going to be working with this material. I'm going to be dedicating a whole chapter just to using this material because it's so robust and it's so important for you to know how to use that material that I've dedicated a lot of time in this product to that material. Okay, so we'll see that later. Now over here, we have this other material right here. This is just a mental ray version of the blend shader. If I go ahead and open up its attribute editor here, go to the blend tab, we have some pretty basic parameters. If I go ahead and do a render region right there. It's basically a blend shader, it's all it is. And it works very similar to the blend shader from Maya. It's basically mental rays equivalent to a blend shader. I like using Maya's blend shader. You could use the mental ray blend shader if you want to, but you can see that the very few parameters are pretty limited. So that's why I actually prefer to use the Maya blend shader. I find it to be more flexible, more robust than the mental ray blend shader here in Maya. Okay. Then we have this other shader over here. That's the Cook Torrent shader. And there is no Cook Torrent shader inside of Maya. So if you're trying to do an effect like this one, like the Cook Torrent's shading effect here, which you can see looks pretty interesting, you might want to go with this mental ray Cook Torrent shader. And what you can do is you can change the index of refraction of the different colors of the shader. So it's very good for doing metallic type objects, very similar to the metallic paint shader over here. It can do these sort of metallic-y type aluminum objects and different types of materials. It's very good for doing, say, copper and things like that. So you might want to use it for different types of metallic objects. Very good for that. And then next to that, we have over here the mental ray Lambert shader. And again, it's mental ray's equivalent of Maya's Lambert shader. As you can see in the IPR, looks very identical to a Maya Lambert shader. If I go ahead and have a quick look at the options here, I just get 3 parameters: ambience, ambient, and diffuse. Okay, so again, very similar, very much like the Maya Lambert shader. Very little difference between the two. And then down here, I have the Phong shader. And mental ray has its own Phong shader, as you can see. Again, I like to stick with the Maya Phong shader, simply because if you look at the attributes, the Maya Phong shader gives me more flexibility and more options and parameters to tweak and change. The mental ray shader doesn't, so I actually prefer to use the Maya Phong shader. Okay, and then over here we have this shader and this shader. Let me do a render region over here over both of these. And these two shaders look very strange. They're supposed to imitate things like wax and skin, things like that. These are the subsurface scattering shaders. These shaders are only available for mental ray. Maya doesn't have by default a subsurface scattering shader, okay? But mental ray does, and that's just one of the neat, flexible, and robust things about mental ray. So we'll look at the first one here. The first one is called, if we look over here, the first one's called the Fast Simple Maya shader, okay? Now, the Fast Simple shader is very good for doing things with subsurface scattering that imitate things of a similar nature in real life. Things like candle wax, things like a bar of soap, different things like that. There's different objects in real life. If you just take the time to look around, even in your own home or even in your office or wherever, you notice that there's plenty of objects around that have subsurface scattering. Usually human flesh and different types of fleshy materials from animals and things has subsurface scattering. If you have a look at your own hands, your own skin, has subsurface scattering. So there's lots of objects in the real world that have subsurface scattering. So Mentor, fortunately and conveniently, has these two shaders for doing subsurface scattering. So what's the difference between the two? Well, the Fast Simple is great for doing less complex objects that require subsurface scattering. Say, a stick of candle wax. Now, this next shader next to it is the Fast Skin Maya. If I go ahead and open up the attributes for that, notice that this one has a lot more attributes, has different layers of subsurface scattering. So we have an epidermal scatter layer, subdermal backscatter. We also have a lot of parameters here for specularity and things like that. This shader is actually excellent for doing human skin. That's what this shader is for. It specializes specifically for doing human skin. Now, you don't have to use it for human skin. You can use it to do alien skin, monster skin, or anything else. You could even use it for a stick of candle wax if you wanted to. If for whatever reason you don't want to use the Fast Simple shader, you can use the Fast Skin shader. Okay? And these are all available for us in Mentor for Maya. And we're going to get to see how to use this shader in another video down the road. Okay, now this video has run for a pretty long time. I just want to show you some of the most common shaders that are used for Mentor and for Maya. And just go ahead and give you a quick overview of some of these shaders and their parameters. Okay, so I'm going to end this video here. And in the next one, we're going to get started with our first example scene. And we're going to get our hands dirty, roll up our sleeves, and jump into Maya and start working with these different shaders and materials in an actual production scene. So, I'll see you there.